What was the Lyceum movement?
It was a public education movement that began in the 1820s and is credited with promoting the establishment of public schools, libraries, and museums in the United States. The idea was conceived by Yale-educated teacher and lecturer Josiah Holbrook. 1788 to 1854, who in 1826 set up the first American Lyceum in Millbury, Massachusetts. He named the program for the place a grove near the Temple of Apollo Lycurgus, where the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle 384 to 322 BC, taught his students. The Lyceums, which were programs of regularly occurring lectures, proved to be the right idea at the right time. They got underway just after the completion of the Erie Canal. 1825, which permitted the settlement of the nation's interior. Just as the notion that universal, free education was imperative to the preservation of American democracy took hold, the movement spread quickly. At first the lectures were homegrown affairs, featuring local speakers. But as the movement grew, Lyceum bureaus were organized, which sent paid lecturers to speak to audiences around the country. The Lyceum speakers included such noted Americans as writers Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1882, Henry David Thoreau, 1817 to 1862, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, 1804 to 1864. As well as activist Susan B. Anthony, 1820 to 1906. After the Civil War, 1861 to 65. The educational role of the Lyceum movement was taken over by the Protestant-led Chautauquas.
When was instant messaging introduced?
The ability to send instant text messages over computers was introduced to the public in 1996. Internet service provider America Online, AOL, launched instant messaging, or IM, as another way for its members to communicate with each other. By logging onto a home or work computer, or cell phone with internet capabilities, users could view their buddy list and see which of their AOL contacts were online at the time. IM users could then send messages back and forth in real time, next door, or across thousands of miles. In 1997, AOL expanded the service to non-AOL users with a utility called AOL Instant Messaging, AIM, and in 1998 the company acquired another IM utility, ICQ. By 1999 MSN and Yahoo rolled out their instant messenger services, and others followed. The concept caught on, particularly with young users who embraced the concept of a private chat room. In 2004, a Pew Internet and American Life Project report estimated that 53 million Americans, or 4 out of 10 Internet users, were instant messaging. IM had become the primary form of communication for many, replacing telephone calls and emails. The mode of communication also brought about a new shorthand, or subculture language, with a heavy reliance on abbreviations and icons. The use of the technology continued to grow rapidly, expanding to practical business use. In 2004, analysts estimated that there were about 600 million registered IM users worldwide.
What was the first American university?
It was Harvard, chartered on October 28, 1636, by the Massachusetts General Court, which passed a legislative act to found a college. It was not until November of the following year, however, that there was further action. It was then that the General Court decreed that the college be built in Newtown, Massachusetts, which in 1638 was renamed Cambridge after England's Cambridge University, where some colonists had studied. In fall of that year, Harvard's first professor, Nathaniel Eaton, began classes, at which time the first building was under construction and a library was being assembled. The university got its name not from a founder, but from a newly arrived British philanthropist and colonial clergyman, John Harvard, 1607 to 1638. Who left the library some 400 volumes and donated about £800 to the college. The institution was named in his honor in 1639, the year after he died. The first state university was the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It was founded in 1789. And in 1795 it became the first public institution of higher education in the United States to begin enrolling students.
Who invented the computer?
English mathematician Charles Babbage, 1792 to 1871, is recognized as the first to conceptualize the computer. He worked to develop a mechanical computing machine called the analytical engine, which is considered the prototype of the digital computer. While attending Cambridge University in 1812, Babbage conceived of the idea of a machine that could calculate data faster than could humans and without human error. These were the early years of the Industrial Revolution. And the world Babbage lived in was growing increasingly complex. Human errors in mathematical tables posed serious problems for many burgeoning industries. After graduating from Cambridge, Babbage returned to the idea of a computational aid. He spent the rest of his life and much of his fortune trying to build such a machine. But he was not to finish. Nevertheless, Babbage's never completed analytical engine, on which he began work in 1834, was the forerunner of the modern digital computer. A programmable electronic device that stores, retrieves, and processes data. Babbage's device used punch cards to store data and was intended to print answers. More than 100 years later, the first fully automatic calculator was invented. Development began in 1939 at Harvard University. Under the direction of mathematician Howard Aiken, 1900 to 1973, the first electronic digital computer called Mark I, was invented in 1944. The Mark II followed in 1947. In 1946, scientists at the University of Pennsylvania completed ENIAC, Electronic Numerical Integrator and Calculator, the first all-purpose electronic digital computer. Operating on 18,000 vacuum tubes, ENIAC was large. Required great deal of power to run, and generated a lot of heat. The first computer to handle both numeric and alphabetical data with equal facility was the UNIVAC. Universal Automatic Computer, developed between 1946 and 1951, also at the University of Pennsylvania.
When was email invented?
Short for electronic mail, email was invented in 1971 by computer engineer Ray Tomlinson, 1941. Who developed a communications program for computer users at the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA. The result was ARPANET, a program that allowed text messages to be sent to any other computer on the local network. ARPANET is now hailed as the Model T of the information superhighway. The technology expanded in the 1970s with the use of modems, which connect computers via telephone lines. Within a decade of its introduction, email had become widely used as a communications mode in the workplace. In the 1990s, usage expanded rapidly to Internet users at home, schools, and elsewhere. Some technology analysts call email the killer app of the Internet. The most powerful tool on the worldwide computer network.
Did Newton invent calculus?
Yes, Newton did invent calculus. But so did German mathematician Gottfried Leibniz, 1646 to 1716, independently of Newton. Both men had developed calculus in the context of trying to explain the laws of physics. Newton's development of calculus predated that of Leibniz, but he failed to publish it. Leibniz published his results in 1684, Newton followed suit in 1693. Each used different symbols and notations. But Leibniz's were considered superior and were more widely adopted, causing friction between the men. Their conflict became a matter of national pride, with English scientists refusing to accept Leibniz's version. Nevertheless, since Newton's system predated that of Leibniz, he is credited as the originator.
Why was Galileo tried for heresy by the Inquisition?
The trouble began for Galileo, 1564 to 1642, in 1613 when he published Letters on the Solar Spots, in which he advocated the Copernican system of the universe, which proposed that Earth, along with other galactic bodies, revolves around the Sun. This view ran contrary to the accepted beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church. whose doctrine was based on Ptolemy's theory that Earth was the center of the universe and that all the planets, including the Sun, revolved around it. Thus, in 1616 the Pope issued a decree declaring the Copernican system to be false and erroneous. And Galileo was ordered not to support it. When a new Pope, Urban VIII, was coronated in 1624, Galileo traveled to Rome to make an appeal that the edict against the Copernican theory be revoked. The Pope declined to do so, but he did give Galileo permission to write about the Copernican system, under the condition that he not give it preference over the church-sanctioned Ptolemaic model. So, in 1632, Galileo published again, Dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. However, contained unconvincing objections to the Copernican view. The Church saw through it and summoned the author to Rome to stand before the Inquisition. Church interrogators. Galileo was accused of violating the original edict of 1616, put on trial for heresy, and found guilty. Though he was ordered to recant, at some point he uttered the famous statement, "And yet it moves," a reference to the Copernican theory that Earth rotates on its axis. Galileo was supposed to be imprisoned, but the Pope commuted the sentence to house arrest at Galileo's home near Florence, where he died blind at the age of 78.
What is fascism?
Fascism is an extreme political philosophy that holds nation and race above the individual and supports the establishment of an authoritarian government, where absolute power is vested in the leader. In post-World War I Italy, a fascist movement developed, led by Benito Mussolini, 1883 to 1945, paralleling the rise of Nazism in Germany. Mussolini took power of the Italian government in 1922, instituting programs of economic and social regimentation. Opposition to his dictatorship was forcibly suppressed. Italy became allied with Germany, under German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler 1889 to 1945. And Japan in 1936 to form the Axis powers, an alliance that was ultimately defeated by the Allied nations. Chiefly Great Britain, the United States, and Soviet Union, in World War II, 1939 to 45. Mussolini died by execution in 1945. Italy's fascist movement dramatically declined at the end of the war.
Did Newton really formulate the laws of motion after observing an apple falling from a tree?
While it may sound more like legend than fact, Newton maintained that it was true. In 1665 Sir Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, who was newly graduated from Cambridge University, escaped bubonic-plagued London and was visiting the family farm. There he saw an apple fall to the ground, and he began considering the force that was responsible for the action. He theorized that the apple had fallen because all matter attracts other matter. That the rate of the apple's fall was directly proportional to the attractive force that Earth exerted upon it. And that the force that pulled the apple was also responsible for keeping the moon in orbit around Earth. But he then set aside these theories and turned his attention to experimenting with light. In the 1680s, Newton revisited the matter of the apple, taking into consideration Galileo's 1564–1642, Studies of Motion, 1602–09. From which the Italian scientist had concluded that falling objects accelerate at a constant rate. In 1687, Newton, with the considerable support of his friend Edmund Halley, of Halley's comet fame, published Principia Mathematica, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, which outlined the laws of gravity and planetary motion. Newton arranged Galileo's findings into three basic laws of motion: 1. A body, any object or matter in the universe, that is at rest tends to remain at rest, and a body in motion tends to remain in motion, moving in the same direction, unless acted upon by an outside force. This is the law of inertia. 2. The force to move a body is equal to its mass times acceleration, F equals ma, where F is force, m is mass, and a is acceleration. And 3. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. These three laws allowed Newton to calculate the gravitational force between Earth and the Moon.
When was the first kindergarten?
The world's first kindergarten opened in 1837 in Blankenberg, Germany, under the direction of educator Friedrich Froebel, 1782–1852. Froebel went on to establish a training course for kindergarten teachers, and he introduced the schools throughout Germany. Such schools and classes for children ages 4 to 6 are the norm today in much of the world.
What was the Chautauqua movement?
It was a cultural, religious, and political education movement that began in the 1870s and lasted into the 1920s. An estimated 45 million Americans participated in the Chautauqua, making it a dominant force in American life during its day. Theodore Roosevelt, 1858–1919, hailed it as the most American thing in America, and, during World War I, 1914–18, Woodrow Wilson, 1856–1924, claimed that it was an integral part of the national defense. Some scholars credit the Chautauqua movement with sowing the seeds of liberal thought in America. The movement began in 1874 at a Methodist Episcopal campsite on the shores of Lake Chautauqua, New York. There a young minister named John H. Vincent, 1932–1920, of Camden, New Jersey, endeavored to train Sunday school teachers in a summer camp atmosphere. The program grew in popularity and was expanded beyond Bible study and religious training to include lessons in literacy, history, and sociology. Chautauqua-style summer camps, commonly called Sunday school assemblies, began popping up across the nation. All of them featured a general meeting hall or pavilion set in a campground. By 1900 there were 200 pavilions in 31 states. Attendees of all ages would attend the summer programs, which featured speakers on a wide variety of subjects, including the arts, travel, and politics. Performances also became part of the movement, with a variety of musicians and entertainers joining the lecturers. Early in the 20th century the Chautauqua became increasingly secular, and went on the road as an organized lecture and entertainment circuit. Speakers and performers traveled from town to town, where tents were set up for weeks at a time to house the summer programs. Many Americans saw their first movies in Chautauqua tents. The movement died out in the mid-1920s, with the improvement of communications and transportations. Some consider the Chautauqua the first form of American mass culture. The Chautauqua Institute in New York continues to host a summer education program in the spirit of the original.
When was color television invented?
In 1940 Hungarian-American engineer Peter Karl Goldmark, 1906 to 1977. The head of the Columbia Broadcasting Systems, CBS, Research and Development Laboratory, came up with a technology that broke down the television image into three primary colors through a set of spinning filters in front of black and white, causing the video to be viewed in color. His system gave way in the 1950s to an RCA system whose signals were compatible with conventional black and white TV signals. In September 1962 American Broadcasting Corporation, ABC, began color telecasts, for 3.5 hours a week. By this time, competitor National Broadcasting Corporation, NBC, was broadcasting 68% of its primetime programming in color, while CBS had opted to confine itself to black and white after having transmitted in color earlier. By 1967 all three networks were broadcasting entirely in color. It was not until 1967 that color television was broadcast in England. On July 1 the BBC Two transmitted 7 hours of programming, most of it coverage of lawn tennis from Wimbledon.
What is the Copernican view of the universe?
The Copernican view of the universe, proposed in 1507, argued that Earth was only one of several galactic bodies that orbit the Sun. This theory, put forth by Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus, Mikołaj Kopernik, 1473 to 1543, was controversial in its day because it ran counter to the astronomical beliefs that had held sway for some 1,400 years, those of the Ptolemaic system, which maintained that Earth is the center of the universe and that the Sun and the planets all revolve around it. Copernicus devised his scheme out of necessity. Really, he had found that using the Ptolemaic system to predict the positions of the planets over long periods of time yielded haphazard results. Once he made the assumption that the Sun, rather than Earth, is the center of the solar system and that all the planets orbit the Sun. Copernicus realized that tables of planetary positions could be calculated much more easily and accurately. However, Copernicus was not the first to put forth such a radical idea. The Greek astronomer Aristarchus of Samos, c. 310–230 BC, was the first to maintain that Earth rotates on an axis and revolves around the Sun. But it was Ptolemy's ideas that took hold, not Aristarchus's. Copernicus did, however, take the argument a step further, averring that Earth itself is small and unimportant compared with the rest of the universe. But the Copernican view had its problems, too. Copernicus assumed that the planetary orbits were perfectly circular. Because of this error, he found it necessary to use some of Ptolemy's cumbersome epicecles. Smaller orbits centered on the larger ones. To reduce the discrepancy between his predicted orbits and those that he observed. It was not until the early 1600s that the elliptical orbit of the planets was put forth by German astronomer Johannes Kepler, 1571–1630.
Separation of church and state affected the public schools?
Religion in American public schools continued to be a hot topic throughout the 1900s. But the Supreme Court rulings in the middle of the 20th century proved to have the most bearing on religious practices in state-supported schools. On June 17, 1963, in an 8-1 ruling, the Supreme Court decided that prayer and Bible reading in U.S. public schools were unconstitutional. The decision, in the case of Skemp v. Abington Township, culminated a series of high court rulings over the course of almost 20 years, which gradually removed the practice of religious activities from public schools. The rulings began in 1947 with the New Jersey case of Everson v. Board of Education, in which the court, in a 5-4 vote, defended the use of state funds to transport children to parochial schools, but warned that a wall of separation between church and state must be maintained. In 1948, in McCollum v. Board of Education, the court banned a program of religious instruction from the schools of Champaign, Illinois. In Engel v. Vital, 1962. The justices of the Supreme Court ruled that the state-composed prayer recited in New York classrooms was unconstitutional.
Who invented the first personal computer?
Development of the personal computer, PC, a microcomputer designed to be used by one person. Was first developed for business use in the early 1970s. Digital Equipment Corporation developed the PDP-8, which was predominantly used in scientific laboratories. The credit for development of a computer for home use goes to Steve Wozniak, 1950. And Steve Jobs, 1955, college dropouts who founded Apple Computer in 1976. They spent 6 months working out of a garage, developing the crude prototype for Apple I, which was bought by some 600 hobbyists who had to know how to wire, program, and set up the machine. Its successor, Apple II, was introduced in 1977 as the first fully assembled programmable microcomputer, but it still required customers to use their televisions as screens and to use audio cassettes for data storage. It retailed for just less than $1. 300 That same year Commodore and Tandy introduced affordable personal computers. In 1984 Apple Computer introduced the Macintosh, Mac, which became the first widely used computer with a graphical user interface, GUI. By this time, International Business Machines, IBM, had introduced its PC, 1981, which quickly overtook the Mac. In spite of the fact that IBM was behind in developing a user-friendly graphical interface.
When was the first university established in the West?
The first modern Western university was established in the Middle Ages 1158 to be exact in Bologna, Italy. It was in that year that Frederick I, c. 1123 to 1190, Holy Roman Emperor, asserted his authority in Lombardy. He granted the first university charter for the University of Bologna, authorizing its students to organize the universities that were set up in Europe during the Middle Ages. 500-1350 were not necessarily places or groups of buildings, they were more often groups of scholars and students. The University of Paris, which today includes the renowned Sorbonne. The university's Liberal Arts and Sciences division, soon became the largest and most famous university in Europe. The Sorbonne itself was founded in 1250 as a school of theology. It was reorganized in the 1600s. By 1500 universities had been founded throughout the continent. Of these, the ones that survive today include the universities of Cambridge and Oxford in England, those at Montpellier, Paris, and Toulouse, France, Heidelberg, Germany, Bologna, Florence, Naples, Padua, Rome, and Siena, Italy, and Salamanca, Spain. The methods and techniques developed in these early institutions set standards of academic inquiry that remain part of higher education in the world today.
When were the first schools established?
The first formal education began shortly after the development of writing, c. 3000 BC, when both the Sumerians, who had developed a cuneiform system of pictographics, and the Egyptians, who developed hieroglyphics, established schools to teach students to read and write the systems. After the development of the first alphabet, between 1800 and 1000 BC, by Semitic people in Syria, religious schools were set up. Priests taught privileged boys to read sacred Hebrew writings, the Torah. The first school that was open to everyone, not just the upper classes, may well have been that established by Chinese philosopher Confucius, 551 to 479 BC, who taught literature and music, conduct, and ethics to anyone who wanted to learn. The Western model of education is based on the ancient Greek schools, which were founded about the 5th century BC, in the city-state of Sparta. Boys were not only trained for the military, they also learned reading and writing and studied music. In Athens, boys learned to read and write, memorized poetry, and learned music as well as trained in athletics. In the second half of the 5th century BC, the Sophists, ancient Greek teachers of rhetoric and philosophy, schooled young men in the social and political arts, hoping to mold them into ideal statesmen.
Why is Johannes Kepler important to modern astronomy?
German astronomer Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630, put forth the theory that planets, including Earth, rotate around the Sun in elliptical orbits. But he had the help of research conducted by astronomer Tycho Brahe, 1546 to 1601, to use as a basis for his conclusion. In 1600 Kepler moved to Prague, Czech Republic, where he began working as an assistant to the flamboyant Brahe, a Danish aristocrat who a few years earlier, in 1576, had set up the first real astronomical observatory in history. Brahe's benefactor in this work was none other than King Frederick II. 1534 to 1588, ruler of Denmark and Norway, who was a patron of science. In the observatory, Brahe had made and recorded extraordinarily accurate observations of planetary positions. Even though he rejected the Copernican, sun-centered, view of the universe because it violated church beliefs, he also realized that his observations of the planets could not be explained by the Ptolemaic system. He soon put forth his own theory of planetary orbit. The tectonic theory was something of a compromise between the two existing models. The sun-centered system of Copernicus and earth-centered system of Ptolemy. Brahe's model followed Copernicus's theory in that it 2. Had the planets orbiting around the Sun, but it kept to the Ptolemaic belief that the Sun orbited Earth. In this way, he accounted for a year. The theory was ignored. But when Brahe hired Kepler in 1600, He turned over his observations to him and charged him with the task of devising a theory of planetary motion. As a mathematician, Kepler was the right man for the job. And he devoted himself to the effort for the next 20 years. At one point, Kepler had devised a scheme that almost matched Brahe's observations, but not quite. Believing Brahe's observations were perfectly accurate, Kepler threw out the scheme and started again. Finally, he gave up on using circular orbits and epicicles. Smaller orbits centered on the larger ones, and began working with ellipses, ovals. When Kepler charted the planets' orbits as ellipses, the results matched Brahe's data. In 1609 Kepler published his first two laws of planetary motion, in the work Astronomia Nova. A planet orbits the Sun in an ellipse, not a circle, as Copernicus had believed. And a planet moves faster when near the Sun and slower when farther away. We also have Kepler to thank for a word that is in everyday use, satellite. After Galileo discovered the moons of Jupiter, Kepler used a telescope to view them for himself. He dubbed them satellites. Satellis is from the Latin meaning attendant, a name that stuck. The celebrated astronomer also did pioneer work leading to the invention of calculus, late 1600s.
When was the first fax machine developed?
The facsimile, machine may seem like a recent invention. But it was developed long ago. It took more than 100 years for the machines to become part of everyday life. In 1842 to 1843 Scottish philosopher and psychologist Alexander Bain. 1818 to 1903, invented the first, albeit crude, fax machine. The scanning technology was improved enough by 1924 that newspapers began using the device to transmit photographs. By the 1930s wire photos were an important component of newspaper reports. It was not until the 1980s that faxes came into widespread use. As manufacturers produced the more compact and affordable machines that are visible in most every place of business today.
When did mobile phones first come into use?
Mobile communication dates back to radio phones used in the 1940s and 1950s. They were two-way radio systems that were powered by car batteries and required operator assistance. They were not very reliable, and the phones were anchored to a place, not a person. The first truly mobile phone call, in that it used a portable handset, was manufactured on April 3, 1973. The caller was Dr. Martin Cooper of Motorola, who, from the streets of Manhattan, called rival researcher Joel Engel at Bell Laboratories. At NT's research arm, the two companies were in a heated race to develop mobile telephony. The device used by Cooper that day was called the Dynatac. It weighed 2 pounds and had simple dial, talk, and listen features. The first generation of mobile phones began to be widely used in the 1980s. These phones were large by today's standards and were usually installed in a car or briefcase. Transmission was via clusters of base stations, or cellular networks. The next generation of mobile phones appeared in the 1990s. The handset and battery technology improved, allowing for more features in smaller-sized phones and greater mobility. These were reliable phones that people could carry with them. As more users adopted the technology, cellular providers expanded transmitting systems. In some areas of the world, usage took off to the point of near universality by 2000. Usage in the United States, though strong, lagged behind the rest of the developed world. Some analysts believed that this was due to relatively high service fees, while others cited a lack of reliability, especially in rural areas. The land-based telephone system in the United States was designed to 9 nines of reliability, meaning it can be counted on to function 99.9999999% of the time. A standard as yet unmet by cellular technology.
Who wrote the first computer program?
The first functional computer program was written by Grace Murray Hopper, 1906-1992, an admiral of the U.S. Navy. She wrote a program for the Mark I computer. Developed in 1944, the first fully automatic calculator. During the 1950s, Hopper directed the work that developed one of the most widely used computer programming languages, COBOL, Common Business-Oriented Language. She is also credited with coining the slang term bug to refer to computer program errors. The story goes that her machine had broken down, and when she looked into the problem, she discovered a dead moth in the computer. As she removed it, she reportedly announced that she was debugging the machine. Hopper served the U.S. Navy for 43 years. From 1943 to 1986, and retired as its most senior officer. She was also a professor at Vassar College and a programmer for the Sperry Rand Corporation from 1959 to 1971. She is one of the pioneers of computer science. The very first computer program written, though never used, was also by a woman. The English Baroness Augusta Ada Byron, the poet Lord Byron's daughter, born 1815, wrote it for Charles Babbage's analytical engine, which was never completed, and so the program was not tested.
Why was the Internet invented?
The computer network was invented in the late 1960s so that U.S. Department of Defense researchers could share information with each other and with other researchers. The Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, developed the Internet. Its users, who were mostly scientists and academics, saw the power of the new technology, wires linking computer terminals in a web of networks allow people anywhere in the world to communicate with each other over the computer. Even though it was developed by the government, the Internet is not government-run. The Internet Society, comprised of volunteers, addresses usage and standards issues. The technology caught on, made more accessible by the innovation of the user-friendly World Wide Web. In spring 2005 there were an estimated 888 million Internet users around the world. About 35% of them in Asia, 30% in Europe, and 25% in North America, about 200 million of those in the United States. The powerful network had become part of everyday life in the developed world.
How did Montessori schools get started?
The schools, evident throughout the United States, as well as Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, Switzerland, Sweden, Austria, France, Australia, New Zealand, Mexico, Argentina, Japan, China, Korea, Syria, India, and Pakistan, carry the name of their founder, Maria Montessori, 1870 to 1952. She was the first woman in Italy to earn a medical degree and to practice medicine. In 1900 Montessori pioneered teaching methods to develop sensory, motor, and intellectual skills in retarded kindergarten and primary school students. Under her direction, these unteachable pupils not only mastered basic skills, including reading and writing, but they passed the same examinations given to all primary school students in Italy. Montessori then spent time in the country's primary schools, where she observed the educators' practice of teaching by rote, by using repetition and memory, and their reliance on restraint, silence, and a system of reward and punishment in the classroom. She believed her system, called scientific pedagogy, which was based on non-coercive methods and self-correcting materials, such as blocks, graduated cylinders, scaled bells, and color spectrums, would yield better results in students. Montessori theorized that children possess a natural desire to learn and, if put in a prepared environment, their spontaneous activity would prove educational. Instead of lecturing to their students, Montessori encouraged educators to simply demonstrate the correct use of materials to students who would then teach themselves and each other. She also believed in community involvement in schools, encouraging parents and other community members to take active roles in the education of the children. When Montessori put these principles into action, it was to highly favorable results. In 1909 Montessori published the Montessori Method, which was made available in English 3 years later and became an instant bestseller in the United States. Her method, which she believed would develop and set free a child's personality in a marvelous and surprising way, caught on. For Montessori, who has been called a triumph of self-discipline, persistence, and courage, Spreading the message about her teaching method became her life's work. She was still traveling, speaking to enthusiastic crowds the world over. When she died in the Netherlands at the age of 81. Montessori's beliefs, which were both scientific and spiritual, had a profound effect not only on students in Montessori schools, but on primary education in general.
What was the Ptolemaic system?
It was a scheme devised by the ancient Greek astronomer Ptolemy, c. 170 c. 100 BC. He proposed a system that placed Earth directly at the center of the universe, with the Sun, the Moon, and the planets all orbiting around Earth. However, Ptolemy observed that the movement of the planets did not match his scheme, and so he added small orbits, called epicicles, to the model to try to make it work. Even though it was erroneous and complicated, the Ptolemaic system was functional enough to make predictions of planetary positions. The system took hold, influencing thinking for 1,400 years. The Roman Catholic Church adopted the system as part of its doctrine, which the church hierarchy held to even when Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus, Mikołaj Kopernik, 1473–1543, refuted it in 1543, arguing that the Sun, not Earth, is the center of the universe. In the 1570s, accurate measurements of planet positions that had been taken by Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, 1546–1601, proved that the Ptolemaic system was inaccurate. But it was not until 1609, when German astronomer Johannes Kepler, 1571–1630, devised a better explanation of planetary orbits, that the Ptolemaic system was put to rest.
Who was Pythagoras?
Known by students today for the Pythagorean theorem, the square of the length of the hypotenuse of a right triangle is equal to the sum of the squares of the lengths of the other two sides. Pythagoras, c. 580 c. 500 BC, was a Greek philosopher and mathematician who lived in the 6th century BC and whose followers kept Pythagoreanism alive into the middle of the 4th century BC. Religious in nature, some have referred to the society as a cult. Pythagoreans believed in the functional and even mystical significance of numbers and made considerable advances in mathematics and astronomy. Pythagoras left no writings, which has prompted some scholars to believe that no such person ever existed, but rather, any doctrines ascribed to him are actually attributable to a group of people. Whatever the case, the Pythagorean legacy is real. It includes the word calculus. Pythagoreans used lines, triangles, and squares made of pebbles to represent numbers. The Latin word for pebble is calculus, the rendering of astronomy and music in numerical patterns, which were studied as mathematical subjects, and the first suggestion, as early as the 6th century BC, that Earth is spherical, not flat, and that Earth, the Moon, and the planets revolve around the Sun.
How old is the World Wide Web?
The web, which adds an ease of use layer to the Internet by providing a graphical user interface. GUI, was developed in 1990 by English computer scientist Tim Berners-Lee. 1955, who wrote the web software at the CERN Physics Laboratory near Geneva, Switzerland. Berners-Lee wrote a program defining hypertext markup language, HTML. Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP, and Universal Resource Locators, URLs. The web became part of the Internet in 1991 and has played a major role in the growing popularity of the International Computer Network, making information more accessible to the user via multimedia interfaces, which allow the presentation of graphics, formatted text and hyperlinks, photos, and illustrations, as well as streaming or downloadable audio and video.
When was the computer chip developed?
The computer chip, or integrated circuit, was developed in the late 1950s by two researchers who were working independently of each other, Jack Kilby, 1923, of Texas Instruments, who developed his chip in 1958, and by Robert Noyce, 1927 to 1990, of Fairchild Semiconductor, in 1959. The chip is an electronic device made of a very small piece, usually less than 1/4 inch square, of silicon wafer, and today has typically hundreds of thousands miniature transistors and other circuit components that are interconnected. Since its development in the late 1950s, the number of tiny components a chip can have has steadily risen, improving computer performance, since the chips perform a computer's control, logic, and memory functions. A computer's microprocessor is a single chip that holds all of the computer's logic and arithmetic. It is responsible for interpreting and executing instructions given by a computer program, software. The microprocessor can be thought of as the brain of the computer's operating system. Many other consumer electronic devices rely on the computer chip as well, including the microwave, the VCR, and calculators.
How old is the concept of public schools?
It dates at least as far back as ancient China. The philosopher Confucius, 551 to 479 BC, was among the first in China to advocate that primary school education should be available to all. He averred that in education there should be no class distinctions. He never refused a student, even though he came to me on foot, with nothing more to offer as tuition than a package of dried meat. Confucius asserted that any man including a peasant boy had the potential to be a man of principle. However, it was not until the Age of Enlightenment that public schools were widely instituted. In Prussia, present-day Germany, Frederick the Great, 1712 to 1786, was considered an enlightened ruler for, among other things, founding a public education system, which became established during the early 1800s. After Prussia united with Germany to form a powerful state, other European countries began instituting systems of public education which were credited by many as an important factor in Prussia's rise. By the early 20th century, public elementary schooling was both free and compulsory in most of Europe. Free secondary education was also offered in some nations. In the United States, public schools had their beginnings during colonial times. In 1647, Massachusetts passed a law requiring the establishment of public schools.
Who was Euclid?
The Greek mathematician Euclid, 330-270 B.C., is considered the father of geometry. He used axioms, accepted mathematical truths, to develop a deductive system of proof, which he wrote in his textbook Elements. This book proved to be a great contribution to scientific thinking and includes Euclid's proof of the Pythagorean theorem. Euclid's first three postulates, with which he begins his Elements, are familiar to anyone who has taken geometry. 1. It is possible to draw a straight line between any 2 points. 2. It is possible to produce a finite straight line continuously in a straight line. And 3. A circle may be described with any center and radius.
When did higher education begin?
About the 6th century B.C. schools of medicine existed on the island of Kos, Greece, where philosophers theorized on the nature of man and the universe. The Pythagoreans, followers of Greek philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras, c. 580 to 500 BC, began the first schools of higher education in southern Italy, where philosophy and mathematics were taught in Greek. The great philosophers Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle carried on the Pythagorean tradition, as did Epicurus and Zeno in the 4th century BC. Universities have a long history in the Arab world, for example. The Al-Azhar University in Cairo was founded in about AD 970 and is one of the oldest universities in the world.
When were schools in the United States desegregated?
On May 17, 1954, in the case of Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled, 9-0, that racial segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. The court overturned the separate but equal doctrine laid down in the 1896 case. Plessy v. Ferguson. Chief Justice Earl Warren, 1891–1974. Ordered the states to proceed with all deliberate speed to integrate educational facilities. Also in 1954, on November 7, the Supreme Court ordered desegregation of public golf courses, parks, swimming pools, and playgrounds. In the aftermath of these rulings, desegregation proceeded slowly and painfully. In the early 1960s, sit-ins, freedom rides, and similar expressions of nonviolent resistance by blacks and their sympathizers led to a decrease in segregation practices in public facilities. How has the U.S.
How extensive were George Washington Carver's agricultural discoveries?
American botanist and agricultural chemist George Washington Carver, c. 1864 to 1943, won international fame for his research, which included finding more than 300 uses for peanuts and more than 100 uses for sweet potatoes. The son of slave parents, Carver was born near Diamond Grove, Missouri, and through his own efforts obtained an education, earning a bachelor's degree in 1894 and his Master of Science in Agriculture in 1896 from Iowa State University. That year he joined the faculty of Alabama's Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University, where he served as Director of Agricultural Research until his death in 1943. His first research projects centered on soil conservation and agricultural practices. Carver gave lectures and made demonstrations to Southern farmers, particularly black farmers, to help them increase crop production. He then turned his attention to finding new uses for two Southern staple crops, peanuts and sweet potatoes. Carver found that peanuts could be used to make a milk substitute, printer's ink, and soap. He also found new uses for soybeans and devised products that could be made from cotton waste. His efforts were all intended to improve the economy in the American South and better the way of life of Southern black farmers. Carver was lauded for his accomplishments. He was named a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts of London. 1916, he was awarded the Spingarn Medal for Distinguished Service in Agricultural Chemistry, 1923. And he was bestowed with the Theodore Roosevelt Medal for his valuable contributions to science, 1939.
What were Galileo's contributions to science and mathematics?
Galileo Galilei, 1564–1642, is credited with establishing the modern method of experimentation. He was the first scientist and thinker to try to prove or disprove theory by conducting tests and observing the results. Prior to Galileo, scientific theory was purely based on hypothesis and conjecture. It was in the interest of conducting accurate tests and in making precise observations that Galileo developed a number of inventions, including the hydrostatic balance. a device designed to measure the density of objects, in about 1586, and the thermometer. One of the first measuring devices used in science, in 1593. The invention most widely credited to Galileo is the telescope. However, he did not originate the instrument, but rather improved it, in 1609. He was also the first to use a telescope to study the skies, which led him to make a series of discoveries. All in 1610, the moon shines with reflected light, the surface of the moon is mountainous. The Milky Way is made up of countless stars, and Jupiter has 4 large satellites. He was even able to correctly estimate the period of rotation of each of these moons, which he named Medicean stars, for his benefactor, Cosimo de' Medici. Galileo was also the first to observe the phases of Venus, which are similar to the moon's, and to discover sunspots. Prior to these astronomical discoveries, Galileo had already made significant contributions to science. In 1589, when he was only 25 years old, he published a treatise on the center of gravity in solids. From 1602 to 1609 he studied the motion of pendulums and other objects along arcs and inclines. From these observations, he concluded that falling objects accelerate at a constant rate. This law of uniform acceleration later helped Sir Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, derive the law of gravity. Galileo also demonstrated that the path of a projectile is a parabola. Galileo was a professor of mathematics at Pisa, 1589 to 1591, and at Padua, 1592-1610, Italy. In 1610 he was appointed philosopher and mathematician. Extraordinary to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo de' Medici.
When did Halley's Comet first appear?
Its first noted appearance was in 239 B.C., but it was British astronomer Edmund Halley, 1656 to 1742, who noted that the bright comet he observed in 1682 followed roughly the same path as those that had been observed in 1531 and 1607. He suggested that they were all the same comet and that it would reappear in 1758. It did reappear, and it was therefore named for Halley, who was England's second astronomer royal. Thanks to Halley, the common man could rest a bit easier at night, before the British astronomer proved, through his observations and previous astronomical data, that comets are natural objects subject to the laws of gravity. People had viewed occurrences of comets as harbingers of doom. Halley's comet has been observed by astronomers every time it has appeared since 239 BC. Most recently, seen in 1985 and 1986, the comet will make another appearance in 2061, and roughly every 76 years thereafter. It's also worth noting that it was Halley who encouraged his friend and fellow scientist Sir Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, to write his theory of gravity, which he did, Principia Mathematica. which Halley used his own money to publish, appeared in 1687 and is considered a seminal work of modern science.
What was the first university in the Western Hemisphere?
It was the University of Santo Domingo, founded in 1538 by the Spaniards in the Dominican Republic, which occupies the eastern half of the Caribbean island of Hispaniola.
How old are Aesop's fables?
They date back to the 6th century B.C. However, it was not until the late 1600s that English-language versions appeared. In 1692 a complete translation of the stories, which are believed to have been written by a Greek slave, were published in London by Sir Roger L'Estrange, 1616 to 1704. The short, moralistic tales, which were handed down through the oral tradition, include the well-known story of the tortoise and the hare, which teaches the lesson slow and steady wins the race, and the one about a wolf in sheep's clothing, people are not always what they seem. Since some of the timeless fables have been traced to earlier literature, many believe it is almost certain that Aesop is a legendary figure.
How old are Aesop's fables?
They date back to the 6th century B.C. However, it was not until the late 1600s that English-language versions appeared. In 1692 a complete translation of the stories, which are believed to have been written by a Greek slave, were published in London by Sir Roger L'Estrange, 1616 to 1704. The short, moralistic tales, which were handed down through the oral tradition, include the well-known story of the tortoise and the hare, which teaches the lesson slow and steady wins the race, and the one about a wolf in sheep's clothing, people are not always what they seem. Since some of the timeless fables have been traced to earlier literature, many believe it is almost certain that Aesop is a legendary figure.
Who were the brothers Grimm?
The German brothers Jacob, 1785 to 1863, and Wilhelm, 1786 to 1859. Best known for their fairy tales, were actually librarians and professors who studied law. Together wrote a dictionary of the German language, and lectured at universities. In 1805 Jacob traveled to Paris to conduct research on Roman law, and in a library there he found medieval German manuscripts of old stories that were slowly disintegrating. He decided the tales were too valuable to lose, and he vowed to collect them. The brothers' interest in fairy tales also led them to search for old traditions, legends, and tales, especially those meant for children. They traveled the German countryside, interviewing villagers in an effort to gather stories, most of which were from the oral tradition and had never been written down. The brothers were diligent in their efforts, recording everything faithfully so that nothing was added and nothing was left out. When the first volume of Kind rund Hausmärchen, literally, the children's household tales, but known better as Grimm's fairy tales, was published in 1812, children loved it. Subsequent volumes were published in German through 1815. The fairy tales collected in the multi-volume work included such classics as The History of Tom Thumb, Little Red Riding Hood, Bluebeard, Puss in Boots, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, The Princess and the Pea, The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, and Cinderella.
Who were the brothers Grimm?
The German brothers Jacob, 1785–1863, and Wilhelm, 1786–1859. Best known for their fairy tales, were actually librarians and professors who studied law. Together wrote a dictionary of the German language, and lectured at universities. In 1805 Jacob traveled to Paris to conduct research on Roman law. And in a library there he found medieval German manuscripts of old stories that were slowly disintegrating. He decided the tales were too valuable to lose, and he vowed to collect them. The brothers' interest in fairy tales also led them to search for old traditions, legends, and tales, especially those meant for children. They traveled the German countryside, interviewing villagers in an effort to gather stories, most of which were from the oral tradition and had never been written down. The brothers were diligent in their efforts, recording everything faithfully so that nothing was added and nothing was left out. When the first volume of Kind rund Hausmärchen, literally, the children's household tales, but known better as Grimm's fairy tales, was published in 1812, children loved it. Subsequent volumes were published in German through 1815. The fairy tales collected in the multi-volume work included such classics as The History of Tom Thumb, Little Red Riding Hood, Bluebeard, Puss in Boots, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, The Princess and the Pea, The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, and Cinderella.